Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Bradley J. Show. And my guest today is David Fenton, author of The Activist Media Handbook Lessons from 50 Years as a Progressive. Thanks for being with us, David.
Pleasure.
I've long felt that progressives have been making tactical errors that keep them from winning and maintaining power. And I was really happy to see a whole book on the subject. And that's why we're here. Getting right to the point, what are a couple of the mistakes that progressives tend to be making?
Well, the main mistake is we don't use language that everyday people can instantly and easily understand. We have our own kind of jargon and rhetoric, and it does not compute for most people. And, we know from cognitive science that the brain learns from the repetition of simple messages. And that's how public opinion changes through repeated exposure to simple messages. And unfortunately, the right knows that better than the progressive world. Like when I say, make America great again, progressives cringe. And I understand that they should, but they should also understand that that's what works, that simplicity and repetition is how people's views change.
You speak about word frames and how messages need to connect with is it word frames or frames, and how messages need to connect with established frames. You need to establish these frames and then connect with them.
Well, actually, it's a little bit different than that. Mental frames, that's the term that linguists use. And linguists will tell you that over your lifetime, as you're exposed to language and also symbols, it forms actual circuits in your brain. Those are called frames. So when you communicate to the public, you want to activate their existing mental frames so that they instantly understand what you mean. I'll give you an example. So, I work on climate change predominantly now because I feel it's the most important issue we all face. And if we don't solve it, we probably won't get to solve much else. So when I say the climate term net zero, most people have no idea what I'm talking about. When I say we have to protect ourselves from pollution, everybody instantly understands what I mean because that's an existing frame. And the other thing about the word pollution is that it's universally disliked. Nobody will say they like pollution. So that's an example of using language that people get.
Right. And when President Biden calls climate change an existential threat, that's an impotent phrase. It doesn't work.
Yeah, a few people in a cafe in Paris understand what that means. It's not, a common usage term in America.
Right. I think that the folks in the progressive think tanks need to sit down and understand or come up with phrases that have impact. Instead of net zero, it's poisoned water. Your drinking water will be poisoned.
Right. Or it will be too hot. Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, this goes pretty deep. Basically, progressives don't like the idea of selling ideas, and they look down on that. I mean, there's exceptions, of course, but predominantly that's that sleazy, manipulative stuff to our community. Whereas on the right, those people go to business school by and large, and they study cognitive and marketing science. So they have to master those techniques to sell products and services in order to advance their careers. Now, we come largely from the humanities, the law, and the sciences, where we have what the linguist George Lakoff calls the Enlightenment fallacy. That is, an idea is just so intrinsically brilliant that it magically sells itself. It's not true.
Or even more irritating to many, progressives will sort of think their ideas are so self-evidently wonderful that they'll sniff and just if you don't get it, well, that's on you, and the people who aren't getting it feel rejected and angry.
Well, that's right. And then we have this other problem on the in the progressive world now, the so-called woke language. And I'm all for everybody being awake. That's a good thing. But when we use terms like intersectional and cisnormative, people have no idea what we're talking about. That's the language of a subculture. Now, the reason this is important is that in our system, we only can change things when we assemble majorities to get electoral power. If you don't assemble a majority, you can't help the poor, the vulnerable, the oppressed, the discriminated against. You have to get power. So if you use language that narrows your appeal, you're not helping the vulnerable and the oppressed, because you're making it so you can't assemble a majority to get power.
Right. And related to that, progressives seem to not understand that they need to compromise on their wish list a little to get and maintain power and concentrate on the meat and potato stuff, to be cliche, like the economy, etc. And then once you've gained and you can maintain power, then you can legislate your wish list. They don't seem to understand that, and they seem unwilling to make those compromises when it comes to the main focus.
Well, it's true. There's a lot of dogmatic, inflexible thinking on the left, and that's not a new phenomenon. I trace in my book how we dealt with that in the 60s with various intransigent factions inside different groups. This is a common occurrence, this ideological purity issue. And of course, you don't want to compromise your principles ever, but tactically, you certainly have to recognize you can't accomplish everything at once.
Is that a result of many progressives being young and inexperienced on and how things really go?
Well, I don't want to sound like some old white guy, but there's no question. I write in my book about how I was a fanatic in my early 20s. It's
right.
It's the age when it's much easier to fall into very black and white thinking about things, and to get kind of grandiose. Like in the 60s, there was this group that was called the Weathermen. They were part originally of Students for Democratic Society, and they broke off and decided that only violence could stop the war in Vietnam. And they started planting bombs at buildings, and they went underground. And they caused a lot of damage, frankly, to the anti-war movement and helped Richard Nixon. So this kind of ideological rigidity and fanaticism is very common in young people. And it's interesting, some of those people that planted those bombs in the 60s have written books, regretting it, and others have defended it to the end. So it's pretty interesting. I'm with the people who self-criticize.
Now, another problem for progressives, which may not be of their own making, is that we live in a post-truth world where the algorithm, at least temporarily a post-truth world, where the algorithm punishes them. The minute, as you say, as I saw you say in an interview with a man from New Zealand, as soon as the algorithm gets a whiff of anything climate change, it will bombard you with all kinds of messaging on how climate change is not true.
Yes. If, for example, the YouTube recommendation engine, that's like the Netflix recommendation engine, what movies to watch. So when YouTube gets a whiff that you're right of center, they'll start serving you material aimed to keeping you coming back to YouTube, which will be super right-wing material, including a lot of climate falsehoods. And quite a few people have tried to get them to take this stuff down, and they won't. This gets into this whole issue of, should free speech protect intentional, knowing falsehood? And that's a complex issue. But I would say that we used to have rules in this country for broadcast television and radio that did not allow that kind of intentional falsehood. There were consequences for it. And Ronald Reagan got rid of those rules, and we're a lot worse off for it.
And I think maybe you could make the argument that that's not the choice of what to feed you is not the speech itself, but an editorializing after the fact of the speech. I mean, you could make of course, the case can be made that the editorializing is speech, that the algorithm does, but also you could make a case that it's not, and
well, it's speech, but the law in the U.S. Gives the tech platform zero liability for anything posted on their platforms. And that was done to keep the internet open and free. However, it had an unintended consequence, which is now that they have these massive algorithms based on artificial intelligence. The problem isn't what an individual posts, by and large. I mean, certain kinds of crazy hate speech, of course, should never be allowed. But the problem is not so much the individual postings, it's when the algorithms of these tech platforms boost those false, disgusting, slimy, salacious, reptilian, sensationalistic posts to millions and millions of people. They should be liable for that. That's acting as a publisher, as an editor. They're making a choice to boost those things. And believe me, if the law was changed so that they were liable for that, like every other business is,
right,
then they would start hiring people to clean up their platforms. So we need to change that law.
And why has the law not already been changed? It's pretty straightforward, pretty self-evident. Is the big tech lobbying keeping any change away?
Yes, it's certainly their lobbying. I think it's also, look, the First Amendment is very important, and the value of free speech is essential in a democracy. So people understandably are cautious about this, but in the end, I think we can either have a democracy or we can have all this intentional falsehood on social media, but we really can't have both. We have to make a choice.
We're speaking with David Fenton, author of a book that I really recommend. I love it because it identifies specific problems and has specific fixes, and it's not the abstract kind of communication type of book that that I grew up with in the 70s. The Activist Media Handbook: lessons from 50 years as a progressive.
Yeah. Plus, it has lots of pictures.
What are in the pictures? I didn't look at the pictures. What can I see?
Oh, well, I used to be a photojournalist.
Right.
In the late 1960s, and I took pictures of riots and tear gas and demonstrations and Black Panthers and lots of big rock stars. So the pictures are in there, and I kept doing photography all my life. So there's pictures of George Soros and Fidel Castro and Nelson Mandela and people that I knew, met, or worked with.
Is it true you also did PR for Rolling Stone?
I did. I was the director of public relations for Rolling Stone in 1977 and 1978. And that was a heady and interesting time there. But, one of the challenges of working at Rolling Stone at that time is that Hunter S. Thompson kept trying to give me drugs all the time. He would constantly be handing me these unidentified pills saying, take this. And I'd say, what is it? And he said he didn't know. So, of course, I never took any of it.
But a lot of the folks watching this are familiar with WBCN because that was kind of their common denominator growing up. And it's interesting that you yourself, that's redundant, that you broadcast on WBCN. Talk about that. Just the short story that it is.
Well, the great Danny Schechter, the news dissector, a legend in Boston at WBCN, was a friend. And when I was 24 years old, 1976, I went and stayed with him for 2 weeks and helped him produce the news every day. And, looking back, it's amazing what Danny did because he made these massive sound collages for the news. And he did it all by himself. And back then, you had to physically cut and splice audio tape to do that. So he'd be frantically splicing all this tape at the last minute, and he always pulled it off. The guy was a genius.
And that was when radio was fun.
Yeah, and when everybody listened, because, that was where the emerging new culture of young people was first that's where you could first experience it. Like my life got changed listening to the radio in New York City, WBAI, when I was growing up, where that was the only place you could hear, the full tracks on Bob Dylan's Blonde on Blonde and hear people speak against the war. So radio had a big impact in the 60s. Yes.
I want to diverge from the book a little bit and just ask you a couple of questions that I've had for a while now. Have you noticed that newer generations are rejecting democracy? And if you have noticed that, why might that be?
I wouldn't say I've noticed that they're rejecting democracy. What do you mean?
It's not working for them, I guess, and so polls tend to show that it's the things that older generations hold sacred, like democracy. It doesn't matter that much to those folks because of the situation, because
Well, look,
their situation, and so they're more likely to say, "Yeah, well, communism. We take a look at that," or a more extreme socialism. Take a look at that.
Oh, you mean on the left?
Yeah,
I mean, I think those are very small communities of people that feel that way. I mean, as you know, the main threat to democracy is on the right, where unfortunately, egged on by Trump, a lot of Republicans are now refusing to accept election results.
right.
Like just happened in Maricopa County, and that is scary as can be. And if I lose, then the vote was rigged. If I win, then the vote was fine.
Right.
This is a new thing in American history.
Are you getting
And this is spread, by the way, on those social media platforms, which, I have a chapter in my book. It's called How Rupert Murdoch and Mark Zuckerberg Ruined America. And what I mean by that is it was the advent of Fox News and then an unfiltered Facebook. That's where QAnon comes from. That's where all this stop the steal nonsense was spread. So this is a cancer in the heart of democracy that we need to do something about.
All right. And finally, your message on messaging is well received. I get it. But how do we get that message on messaging to everywhere it needs to go? How do we get it beyond the people who read your book? How do we get it into every academic situation, every progressive think tank? What can we do at home to make this happen? Because until you reach even the people that don't read your book, people won't have a gut instinct on the proper way to message and the proper way to avoid tactical mistakes.
Well, I'm doing my best to try to start a conversation among progressives about this. And in particular, I'm focused on the climate change community because, again, this is the most important issue humans face. And in that community, we could do a great deal to have better communications. And if we did, public knowledge and therefore urgency and concern about this would go way up. And we must make that happen because, we're facing a very corrupt oil, coal, and gas industry. It's very powerful. And they're corrupting politicians. And the only antidote to that is an informed, aroused, and mobilized public. So that's where I'm putting my efforts to help the climate community do a much better job of informing the public so we can do something about this at the scale needed.
Speaking of corrupt, again, taking from that interview with the person from New Zealand, you talked about the election, how elections run, and you asked him if paid advertising, paid political advertising was allowed, and he said in most countries it's not allowed at all.
Right.
And we are the only country that allows PACs, et cetera. And so really, wow. I mean, when you step back and see the big picture, our electoral system is corrupt. Is there any fix for that?
Well, it's not completely corrupt. Some good people still win elections. In Western Europe, in most countries, you cannot buy paid political television advertising. It's illegal. There are some where you can. And what they do instead is require all the media platforms to give free and equal time to all major candidates. And I mean time, not just, 30-second demagoguery. And that's a much better system. And I believe that part of why they do that in Europe is that they saw how propaganda brought them Hitler and fascism. And so they know that there have to be rules about this stuff to make sure that there is less opportunity for intentional distortion. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine America banning paid political advertising, but I think at some point we will evolve to not just let anybody buy any false piece of garbage that they want. That cannot go on forever.
There used to be a rule, as you probably remember, as a broadcaster, that if you mentioned one candidate, you had to provide equal time for
That's
the other
right.
candidates.
The equal time doctrine that you referred to was the law of the land. And you would lose your broadcast license if you didn't adhere to it. And by the way, that meant it was self-policing, because the station owners were never going to risk losing their license.
Right.
And my view, and the view of the people that crafted those laws, was that it protected free speech. When Fox gave all of its airtime to Trump, that was suppressing the free speech of other candidates. And we also had this other rule called the fairness doctrine, which said you had to broadcast all sides of a controversial issue. So Ronald Reagan repealed those laws in 1984, and he did it on purpose so the right could dominate the airwaves. And that's when Rush Limbaugh was able to start his program. Before 1984, what Rush Limbaugh ended up doing would have been illegal. And wouldn't we have been better off without him?
David Fenton, it's so great to talk to you. I really appreciate the time. It's David Fenton, the author of The Activist Media Handbook. Get it now. Lessons from 50 years as a progressive. You're an interesting guy. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you. It was fun, Bradley.
Thank you. Bye, all. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
So we'll be off.